researchers reconstructing prehistoric human migration have confirmed something genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Ancient humans managed to spread from Africa into deserts, forests, mountain corridors, Arctic coastlines, Australia, and eventually some of the most isolated islands on Earth without a single printed map, without a compass, without satellite positioning, and without any written travel guide explaining how any of it was actually done. No GPS, no road signs, no overhead view of the planet. No classroom chart showing where the coastline bent, where the rivers led, or which stars to trust at night. Just accumulated observation, practiced memory, and an astonishing ability to read the world directly. And honestly, that should probably force us to reconsider what we even mean when we ask how ancient humans crossed the world without maps. Because hidden inside that question is a very modern assumption. The assumption that a map is the only serious way to know where you are going. But for most of human history, spatial knowledge did not live on paper. It lived in people. It lived in memory, in stories, in habits, in repeated routes, in seasonal timing, in coastline knowledge, in star patterns, in the behavior of birds, in the shape of mountain ranges, in the sound of water, and in the kind of practical environmental intelligence that modern people, surrounded by screens and navigation apps, rarely have any reason to develop anymore. And if these kinds of ancient human mysteries are exactly your thing, subscribe now, because the deeper you go into prehistoric survival, migration, and navigation, the more ridiculous it becomes to keep underestimating just how technically capable early humans actually were. Let's start with the most important point in this entire topic because it changes the whole picture immediately. Ancient humans usually were not trying to cross the world in the way a modern person imagines it. They were not standing in one place, looking at a horizon and announcing some grand plan to travel from Africa to the Pacific in one impossible heroic expedition. Most movement was smaller, slower, and much more local in the short term. A family group moved toward better hunting. Another group followed a river valley. Another pushed along a coastline during a favorable season. Another expanded into nearby territory because the old one had become crowded or less productive. But repeated across centuries and then across thousands of years, that slow outward pressure becomes something enormous. That distinction matters a lot because it means ancient migration was usually not global in intention. It became global as a result. A group might only know the next valley, the next shoreline, the next reliable water source, the next seasonal route used by animals, or the next safe crossing known through oral tradition. They did not need a complete map of the planet. They needed accurate knowledge of the corridor directly ahead of them and enough inherited experience to survive it. Then the next generation inherited that new edge of knowledge and pushed slightly farther. What looks from a modern aerial perspective like a species crossing continents was, from the ground, often a long chain of manageable steps. Now, let's bring up the most basic driver behind those steps because it is almost embarrassingly simple. Food. Ancient humans were not exploring for the romance of discovery. They were following opportunities and avoiding scarcity. Game herds moved. Fruit and plant resources changed by season. Rivers shifted. Drought affected some regions while making others more attractive. Coastlines provided shellfish, fish, and predictable movement corridors. Grasslands opened routes for hunting. Forest edges created mixed resource zones. So what we often call migration was very often resource tracking over long spans of time. People moved because staying still was sometimes the more dangerous choice. And once you understand that, something else becomes obvious. Ancient humans did not need abstract world maps because nature itself was already giving them directional structure. Rivers are directional. Coastlines are directional. Mountain chains create corridors and barriers. Seasonal winds repeat. Animal migrations repeat. The sun repeats. The stars repeat. Even vegetation patterns repeat in meaningful ways. In other words, the landscape was not random noise. It was information. Ancient people who depended on reading it every day were operating inside a world that was full of guidance, even if none of that guidance had been flattened into a drawn diagram. Let's bring in something genuinely important here regarding memory, because this is where modern intuition often breaks down badly. We tend to assume that if something is not written down, it must be vague, fragile, or unreliable. But oral cultures regularly preserved extremely complex practical knowledge with astonishing consistency because survival depended on it. The location of reliable water, the dangerous stretch of coast, the pass that closes in winter. The time birds begin moving, the stars that rise where land lies. The sequence of landmarks needed to reach a destination. This kind of knowledge was not casual trivia. It was life-preserving information, repeated, practiced, and passed down with seriousness. That means what ancient humans carried in their heads was not the absence of a map. It was a different kind of map. A live map. A map made of remembered relationships rather than drawn geometry. Follow the river until the rock face splits. Cross after the second bend when the water runs low. Travel when this wind begins. Head toward the sunrise point of a particular star. Keep the mountain ridge on your left. Watch for the seabirds that leave land at dawn and return at dusk. None of that looks like a modern atlas, but functionally it solves the same problem. It tells you where you are, what comes next, and how not to die getting there. Now let's bring up human physical capability, because it deserves real credit in this discussion too. The human body is remarkably well suited for covering distance on foot compared to what many modern people assume. Upright walking, efficient heat regulation through sweating, endurance-oriented musculature, and the ability to maintain moderate effort for long periods gave ancient humans a travel capacity that was far more practical than it looks from the perspective of sedentary modern life. Walking 10 or more miles in a day under normal conditions would not have been an absurd superhuman feat for populations conditioned from childhood for exactly that kind of daily movement. That matters because even without animals, wheels, or roads, the human body itself was already a reliable travel technology, but physical endurance alone is nowhere near enough to explain how people crossed unfamiliar ground without getting lost. So now we need to bring in something considerably more important: environmental literacy. Ancient travelers had to know how to read terrain in ways most of us never learn. Which valleys funnel water even when the surface looks dry? Which plants indicate moisture underground? Which cloud formations suggest nearby land or incoming weather? Which animal tracks lead toward water? Which slope exposures hold snow longer? Which coastlines offer safer landing points? This is not mystical intuition. It is accumulated observation refined over generations until it becomes a dependable operating system for moving through the world. Let's also address something crucial about route finding more broadly. Ancient humans often preferred movement along what you could call natural highways. Coastlines are one obvious example. A coastline gives food, a clear directional edge, fewer chances of wandering in circles, and repeated ecological clues. River systems do something similar inland. They provide water, animal concentrations, plant resources, and a predictable corridor through otherwise difficult terrain. Major valleys, lake chains, and open grasslands work the same way. So when we imagine ancient humans stumbling randomly across huge blank spaces, we are almost certainly picturing the process all wrong. In many cases, they were following structures built directly into the landscape itself. This is one reason the journey out of Africa matters so much in this conversation. Evidence reviewed by researchers has long treated the Bab el-Mandeb region at the mouth of the Red Sea as one plausible southern route for early modern human dispersal out of Africa, especially during periods when environmental conditions made crossings more manageable. That detail is important, not because it gives us a neat single-story explanation for all human migration, but because it shows a recurring pattern. Ancient humans succeeded not merely through toughness, but through timing and opportunity. Narrower crossings, better climate windows, more favorable coastlines. The world did not always look like it does now, and ancient humans repeatedly took advantage of those temporary advantages when they existed. Now, let's bring up the idea of landmarks because this is where navigation without maps becomes much easier to imagine. A drawn map gives you an overhead abstraction, but a traveler on the ground does not actually need that abstraction if the route can be broken into recognizable sequences. A tall ridge line, a split boulder, a bend in the river. A marsh that appears in one season and vanishes in another. A bay protected from the wind. A gap between mountains. Ancient navigation could be intensely sequential. You do not need to know the whole planet when you know the order in which the land reveals itself. And this sequence-based thinking becomes even more powerful when repeated over generations. The first people to move through a region might do so cautiously and at real risk. But once a route proves workable, it can become part of shared cultural memory. The second trip is smarter than the first. The third is safer. The 10th becomes tradition. By then, navigation is no longer improvised every time from scratch. It is trained, apprenticed, socially reinforced. Children grow up already hearing the route before they ever walk it. Let's bring in the sky now, because if you want to understand how humans crossed enormous distances without maps, especially over water or open terrain, the sky matters enormously. The sun gives broad orientation during the day. The stars provide stable directional reference at night. Particular star groups rise and set in reliable parts of the horizon depending on season and latitude. Once navigators learned these patterns, the sky became a repeatable framework, one far more dependable than many land features that might change with weather or visibility. This is one of the most important reasons ancient navigation should be treated as a technical skill rather than a romantic mystery. It relied on pattern recognition, memory, calibration, and repeated correction. And nowhere is that more obvious than in Polynesian wayfinding. Traditional Polynesian voyagers used a remarkably sophisticated system built from stars, sun position, wind direction, cloud behavior, seabird movements, and especially the way islands disrupt and reflect ocean swells, allowing skilled navigators to infer land that was still beyond direct sight, exploring our fluid Earth. That deserves far more respect than it usually gets, because from a modern perspective, crossing open ocean without charts sounds like suicide. But for navigators trained inside that tradition, the ocean was not an empty, featureless void. It was a field of signals. This point matters enormously because it destroys one of the laziest misunderstandings about ancient seafaring: the idea that remote islands were mostly settled by accidental drifting. That theory sounds superficially convenient until you remember what successful settlement actually requires. People do not permanently colonize distant islands by random misfortune alone. You need enough people to establish a viable population. You need tools. You often need transported plants or animals. You need expectations about where land is likely to be. In many cases, that implies planning. It implies confidence. It implies navigation knowledge serious enough that voyagers believed the voyage was worth attempting in the first place. If you're enjoying this so far, subscribe here in the middle too, because this is exactly the kind of topic where ancient humans start looking less like primitive wanderers and more like extraordinarily disciplined observers who learned to turn the whole planet into something readable. Now, let's bring up Australia, because this is one of the most fascinating examples in the entire subject. Aboriginal occupation of mainland Australia is known to extend back at least 65,000 years, according to the National Museum of Australia, And that fact matters enormously because even during lower sea levels, reaching Sahul still required deliberate water crossings. In other words, humans were getting themselves across open water astonishingly early. We still debate the exact forms of watercraft used and the full details of how those crossings were organized, but the basic implication is unavoidable. Humans were experimenting successfully with maritime movement tens of thousands of years before the later Polynesian tradition that usually gets most of the public attention. That should probably change the emotional tone of this whole topic. Because once early humans are reaching Australia that early, the question is no longer whether humans without maps could navigate difficult routes. The question becomes how often our species was quietly doing things much more competently than popular imagination usually allows. If people were already planning water crossings, reading coasts, timing movement, and surviving landfall in unfamiliar territory long ago, then ancient navigation was not some late luxury of civilization. It was part of the deep human toolkit. Now let's bring up Beringia because this is a completely different but equally important kind of navigation story. During glacial periods, lower sea levels exposed a broad land connection between Asia and North America, commonly referred to as Beringia NPS. That meant some of what looks to us today like an impossible intercontinental divide was, at particular moments in prehistory, a traversable land corridor. Again, this reinforces the same principle we keep seeing. Ancient migration succeeded through environmental intelligence. People did not need a modern map of the globe showing a future ocean between Siberia and Alaska. They needed to understand the land that actually existed in front of them at that time. And this is exactly why climate matters so much in any honest explanation of ancient human movement. Glacial periods changed coastlines. Sea levels fell. Land bridges emerged. Resource zones shifted. Travel corridors opened and closed. A map printed today can make prehistoric movement look more confusing than it really was, because the land itself was not identical. Ancient humans were navigating real-time environments, not modern reconstructions. So, when they moved, they were responding to the geography they actually encountered, not the one hanging on a classroom wall thousands of years later. Let's also address something genuinely interesting about boats more broadly, because without maps does not mean without technology. It only means without one specific technology. Ancient people repeatedly developed watercraft suited to their local conditions, dugout canoes in heavily wooded regions, reed boats in places where reeds were abundant, skin boats in areas with limited timber, and more complex seagoing craft where maritime travel became strategically important. Technology and navigation knowledge evolved together. A better boat expands the range of possible movement, but that expanded range only becomes useful if people also know how to orient themselves once they are out there. That connection between vehicle and knowledge is easy to miss, but it is genuinely important. A canoe is not enough. A sail is not enough. An outrigger is not enough. You need the behavioral system around the object, when to leave, which winds to trust, how much water to carry, what stars to watch, what to do when swells shift, how to identify birds associated with nearby land, how to avoid currents that carry you beyond recovery. Ancient travel technology was never just material. It was material plus memory plus training. Now let's bring up timing, because timing may be one of the most underappreciated navigation tools in all of ancient history. Travel is easier when done in the correct season. Rivers are lower or higher at predictable times. Some passes become dangerous in winter. Coastal winds reverse seasonally. Bird patterns change. Storm frequency shifts. The visibility of certain stars changes through the year. So even without maps, calendars of observation helped structure movement. A good route taken in the wrong season can kill you. A difficult route taken in the correct season becomes survivable. Ancient humans did not eliminate risk, but they often reduced it through timing sophisticated enough to look almost invisible from a modern distance. Let's also bring in social organization here, because crossing large distances is not just a navigation problem. It is a group problem. Someone has to remember the route. Someone has to carry knowledge of water or food storage. Someone has to recognize the weather. Someone has to coordinate movement speed with children, elders, or supplies. Someone has to decide when to stop, when to turn back, and when to push ahead. In unfamiliar territory, trust becomes essential. Ancient long-distance movement was therefore not simply the achievement of brave individuals. It was very often the achievement of cooperative groups whose shared memory was more powerful than any single person alone. This social dimension becomes even more important when we think about teaching. No map means knowledge cannot just be handed to a stranger as a folded document. It has to be embodied and transmitted. That means repetition, storytelling, ritualized instruction, apprenticeship, and shared practice. A skilled navigator or route expert is not only valuable because they know where to go. They are valuable because they are the storage medium for survival knowledge. Lose that person before the knowledge is passed on, and a route can become far more dangerous immediately. Now, let's bring up the risk honestly, because this topic gets distorted if we talk only about the successful crossings. Ancient humans populated almost every habitable region on Earth, but that does not mean every attempt succeeded. Some journeys almost certainly ended in starvation, dehydration, storms, wrong landfalls, hostile conditions, or simple failure to find resources quickly enough. The archaeological record is built from survivors and lasting settlements, not from every unsuccessful experiment. So the story here is not that ancient humans moved without maps, and therefore everything was somehow easy. The story is that enough groups became good enough, often through repeated trial and error, that the successful routes accumulated and the species kept expanding. That accumulated success is also why trade networks matter in this conversation. Even when whole populations were not migrating, goods often moved over large distances through linked exchanges. Stone, shells, metals, pigments, salt, and other materials frequently traveled much farther than a single individual community's home range. That tells us something important. Repeated long-distance route knowledge existed. Communities might not need a full map of the total network, but they knew the next segment, the next partner, the next corridor. And once again, this is the same pattern. Distributed geographic intelligence can move people and objects very far even when nobody possesses a single totalized image of the entire system. Let's also talk about deserts for a moment because they seem like the kind of place where navigation without maps should become impossible. But deserts, too, are structured if you know how to read them. There are wells, seasonal water points, dune patterns, stars, wind-shaped landforms, routes between oases, and travel traditions so old that later caravan systems could build on them. In some regions, animals like camels eventually transformed range and carrying capacity dramatically, but even before or alongside animal transport, the basic principle remained the same. Surviving harsh terrain depended less on abstract cartography and more on exact practical knowledge, where the next water lies, when to move, and what environmental signs not to ignore. Rivers deserve their own moment here too, because rivers are basically prehistoric navigation cheats. They are water supply, direction, food, and corridor all at once. Follow a river and you reduce the problem of orientation dramatically. Paddle a river and you extend range. Settle along a river and you create chains of communities that can exchange people, ideas, and goods. Some of the biggest concentrations of human civilization formed around river systems later on, but long before states and cities, rivers were already doing the simpler job that mattered first. They told humans where movement was easiest and where life was most likely to continue. Now, let's bring the conversation back to cognition itself, because there is something genuinely profound hiding underneath all of this. Humans are a map-making species even when no paper is involved. The brain naturally builds spatial models from repeated movement. Turn left at the ridge, right at the stream, climb until the rock shelf, continue until the wind shifts and the coast reappears. Do that enough times, and the route becomes mentally compressed into a usable internal structure. Ancient humans were not navigating without maps in the absolute sense. They were navigating with internal maps, social maps, oral maps, seasonal maps, and environmental maps, and those forms of mapping may actually be better than paper in some contexts. A paper map can show terrain, but it does not automatically tell you when the river floods, which bird means land is near, how the swell changes around a hidden island, or where fresh water lies after a drought. Lived knowledge contains time, behavior, season, danger, and practical judgment. That is why traditional navigators can sometimes outperform outsiders even in regions that have been formally charted. A diagram shows where a place is. Experience tells you how the place behaves. This is exactly why Polynesian navigation remains one of the best examples in the world for understanding the difference between abstract, mapping, and embodied wayfinding. Master navigators did not need a modern printed map to know their position in relation to islands, stars, swells, and winds. They had trained memory systems calibrated to the ocean itself. And from a modern perspective, that can feel almost unbelievable, not because it was impossible, but because we have outsourced so much spatial cognition to machines that highly trained human orientation now looks supernatural, when really it is practiced perception. Let's also address one subtle but enormously important point. Ancient humans did not have to know everything. They only had to know enough. This matters because modern people sometimes reject ancient navigation by imagining impossible standards, as if early travelers needed exact longitude, exact latitude, a complete continental outline, and a mathematically scaled chart before movement could count as competent. But successful travel does not demand total knowledge. It demands sufficient knowledge, enough to reach water, enough to avoid a dead end, enough to return, enough to repeat the route, enough to teach someone else. And once sufficient knowledge exists, expansion becomes self-reinforcing. A new shoreline is learned, a new crossing is added, a new campsite becomes regular, a new seasonal route becomes an inherited tradition. Knowledge compounds geographically just like migration compounds demographically. This may be the single biggest reason our species spread so far. Not because humans began with a master plan for the world, but because we repeatedly turned local success into transferable memory. There is also a psychological dimension here worth appreciating. To travel beyond familiar territory without a drawn map requires a tolerance for uncertainty that many modern people would find deeply uncomfortable. Ancient humans had to operate in a world where full information was rarely available. Yet they still moved, still adapted, still experimented, still judged risks, and still kept expanding. That does not mean they were reckless. In many cases, it means they had social systems and practical intelligence strong enough to function under uncertainty without becoming paralyzed by it. And maybe this is the right place to bring up one of the biggest misconceptions of all. When people say ancient humans crossed the world without maps, it can sound like they were navigating through ignorance. But the opposite is much closer to the truth. They crossed the world because of knowledge, dense, tested, situation-specific knowledge. Knowledge of coastlines, stars, weather, animals, currents, seasons, materials, boats, river corridors, landmarks, and memory systems. The absence of paper did not mean the absence of orientation. It meant orientation was embedded differently. Finally, let's pull the whole picture together. How did ancient humans cross the world without maps? They did it first by usually not trying to cross the whole world at once, but by moving gradually through generations in response to food, climate, crowding, and opportunity. They did it by treating rivers, coasts, valleys, and open corridors as natural highways. They did it through practical environmental literacy so refined that landscapes, skies, and oceans became readable information systems rather than blank obstacles. They did it by storing geographic knowledge in memory, story, apprenticeship, and repeated route use instead of written diagrams. They did it by exploiting favorable climate windows and changing prehistoric geographies such as Beringia and workable southern dispersal routes out of Africa. They did it with boats when boats were necessary, and they did it astonishingly well early enough to reach Australia, at least 65,000 years ago National Museum of Australia. And in the Pacific, they did it with some of the most sophisticated non-instrument navigation ever developed, using stars, swells, clouds, birds, and disciplined memory, exploring and honestly, maybe the most genuinely impressive takeaway from this entire subject is not just that ancient humans crossed the world without maps. It is that for most of human history, humans themselves were the maps. The root lived in the body, in the mind, in the community, and in the generation-to-generation transfer of practical knowledge. We reached nearly every habitable corner of the planet, not because we had a complete picture of the Earth from the start, but because we kept building that picture step by step, shoreline by shoreline, star by star, season by season, until eventually our species had learned how to live almost everywhere. So the next time the modern world makes prehistory look primitive, it is probably worth remembering this. Our ancestors crossed continents, deserts, land bridges, and open ocean not by wandering blindly, but by reading a planet we have largely forgotten how to read. And if you want more scripts like this that make ancient humans look as intelligent, resilient, and technically impressive as they actually were, subscribe now, because once you start looking closely at prehistory, the real surprise is not how little early humans knew. It is how much they managed to know without ever writing most of it down.